In the beginning there is only breath, and the faintest trace of smoke rising into a sky that does not yet know its own borders. The world is young in its remembering, old in its bones. Night settles over a continent unnamed by maps, a vast sweep of forest and river, mountain and plain, where the wind carries the murmurs of insects and the distant roll of unseen seas. Stars hang close and numerous, like grains of salt scattered upon a dark cloth. In the hush between one heartbeat and the next, a small fire glows in a clearing. Around it, human figures sit in a slow circle, their faces lit from below by coals the color of old embers and new dawns. Between their hands passes a leaf dried and bound, a narrow cylinder of plant and intention. Its tip smoulders, its breath ascends. The smoke is thin at first, a pale thread twisting upward, as if unsure whether it belongs to earth or sky. Picture, if you will, these Americas before the tight lines of latitude and longitude have caged them on parchment. Forests stretch like dark oceans, their canopies murmuring in a language of leaves. Rivers carve silver roads through green abundance, turning the low light of evening to ribbon and glass. In clearings long tended by unseen hands, a certain plant grows, its leaves broad and sticky, holding sunlight in their green thickness. It rises from the soil with quiet certainty, unhurried yet insistent, as though answering a question the earth has been asking since the first rains. This is tobacco, though it does not yet know that name, any more than the people who approach it know words such as alkaloid or nicotine. What they know is presence. What they know is a sensation that waits, folded in each vein of each leaf, like lightning sleeping inside a cloud. Hands reach for the plant with a care not reserved for ordinary food or fodder. These are hands that have learned the weight of seasons, that read the sky and the wing beats of birds for signs. They touch the leaves and feel the faint tackiness of resin, the promise of power. In villages tucked along riverbanks and upon wind-cooled plateaus, tobacco is gathered not by chance but by custom, in times marked by stars and stories. To pluck it is to enter a conversation older than memory. Shamans and elders carry the leaves away in woven baskets, their steps measured, their faces composed. They move toward fires built not for warmth or cooking, but for transformation. Around low flames the leaves are dried with patience, turning from green to a deeper, leathery shade. The air grows thick with an aroma both bitter and sweet, dark and inviting, as if the plant itself is exhaling something it has held in secret. Other herbs join it, fragrant blossom, mountain leaf, ground bark, each chosen for their own ways of touching the unseen. Together they are crumbled, mixed and rolled, or packed into hollow reeds and carved bowls of stone and bone. There is no hurry. Time moves with the crackle of twigs, with the settling of ash. When at last fire meets leaf, the reaction is as ancient as the first lightning to strike the first dry branch. A red point glows, a faint char creeps forward, and from that ember rises smoke, blue at its edges, grey at its heart, twisting in slow dance with the air. It curls around faces painted with ochre and ash, slips through feathered headdresses, drifts upward into crowns of stars. The first inhale is deep and deliberate. Lungs expand, drawing the transformed plant into the secret caverns of the body. A tingle calls at the fingertips, a subtle pressure gathers behind the eyes, thought sharpens, or unfurls, or sways on some inner tide. Each inhalation becomes a question addressed to whatever listens beyond the visible. Each exhalation is an answer dissolving in the cool evening, a message sent back to the sky, to the ancestors, to the spirits presumed to lean close. In this age before anyone weighs or measures, before beakers and balances and meticulous journals, nicotine is not yet a name, but a presence. It moves unseen in the bloodstream, an invisible guest slipping into the circle. It rouses the heart, quickens the pulse, and lays a thin veil of euphoria over the mind. Those who sit by the fire feel it as clarity, as courage, as a door swinging open in the wall between waking and dream. They also know it can be relentless, that too long beneath its wing can lead to dizziness, to sickness, to wandering too far from the tether of one's own body. The plant is understood as both remedy and risk, a bridge that must be crossed with intention, not stumbled upon. Under sky thick with stars, voices rise in chant and song. Smoke braids itself with melody, with the steady beat of drums carved from hollow trunks and stretched high. Stories are told of how tobacco came to the people, perhaps carried by a bird from the realm of gods, perhaps grown from the grave of a hero, perhaps gifted in a dream. In these tales, it is never ordinary. It is always tied to sacrifice, to covenant, to the fragile peace between humanity and forces wider than itself. Belief is a gift that can soothe fever, steady the mind before a hunt or a battle, and open doors in the darkness where guides and guardians may be found. It is also a warning in green form, demanding reverence from any hand that holds it. Elsewhere in the world, fires burn other offerings. In river valleys where Sumerian cities rise as mud brick visions from the floodplains, people burn resins and fragrant woods for their gods. Egyptian priests lift braziers of incense in stone temples where columns bloom like papyrus stems. In Greek sanctuaries, smoke from sacrificed animals winds upward toward marble ceilings painted with star patterns, while philosophers debate the nature of soul and element. In the courts of the Islamic Golden Age, physicians discuss perfumes and distillations, studying how the volatile soul of a plant may be captured in glass. Yet none of these fires know tobacco. That particular leaf belongs, for now, only to the Americas, guarded by distance and ocean, held close by those who see in its smoke a way to speak with what lies beyond the perimeter of sight. As centuries unspool like threads from a spindle, the wild patches of tobacco are brought closer to human dwellings. Seeds that once fell by chance are now deliberately saved, dried in the sun, and pressed into the soil of cleared plots. Tobacco steps from forest edge to tended garden, from wild whisper to household presence. It becomes a companion to maize and beans, to squash and medicinal herbs. In Maya cities of stone rising from the jungle like white teeth through green gum, in Indian villages, clinging to slopes where clouds drift past at eye level. And across Caribbean islands, strung along azure water like a priest's beads, tobacco is woven into the fabric of daily life and sacred time. Imagine painted murals where gods hold gourds and pipes, their lips parted as if mid-exhale. Picture carved glyphs where curling lines of smoke double as signs for breath, for spirit, for the thin veil between the world. In plazas thronged with dancers adorned in feathered cloaks, tobacco is burned as offering to bring rain or victory, to ward off misfortune, to cleanse the path before diplomatic meetings between rival lords. Its leaves are rolled into cigars, thick as fingers, or packed into elegantly carved tubes of wood and clay. Hollow reeds carry its smoke directly into the lungs of those seeking visions, novices trembling on the threshold of priesthood, warriors preparing to test their courage, healers fasting and then inhaling, waiting for songs and plant names to arrive in their mind. In cool, smoky rooms where healers work, tobacco is both scalpel and salve. Its juice is applied to wounds as antiseptic, its smoke blown gently over fevered bodies in spirals meant to lift out illness and restore balance. Cured leaves are chewed during long journeys to erase fatigue, or used in small doses to sharpen concentration in games of strategy and prophecy. Yet always there are boundaries. Certain preparations are reserved only for experienced shamans, their dosages known not by numbers but by lineage, by dreams in which elders and spirits speak. To overuse the plant is to invite a kind of spiritual vertigo, a spinning away from the axis that keeps body and soul alive. Tales circulate of those who became lost in visions, never quite returning, their eyes forever fixed on some distant point beyond immediate life. Tobacco's power is bracketed by taboo and instruction, its consumption circled by ritual phrases of permission and thanks. Here in these layered societies, nicotine still has no label, no structural diagram drawn in ink, no entry in the lexicon of chemistry that does not yet exist, and yet it is intimately known by flesh and nerve, by hearts that race and then steady, by minds that find edges sharpened, colors brightened, stories more vivid after an encounter with its smoke. The plant's bitterness is balanced by other herbs, sweet leaves, honeyed blossoms, aromatic barks that soften the taste, round the experience teach that intense encounters with the sacred must be tempered and framed. Its fire is cradled in ceremonial forms that emphasize respect, reciprocity and restraint. Tobacco is never a thing to reach for idly. It is accompanied by song, by silence, by the presence of community. Beyond the horizon's blue curve, The old world spins in its own cycles of empire and discovery. Phoenician traders hug coastlines, Greek sailors map constellations, Roman legions march under standards bearing eagles and laurel. In all these lands, smoke plays its own roles, purifying, sanctifying, obscuring, but there is an absence here, a blank space where tobacco will one day root itself with astonishing speed. It waits, a restless seed of history, in the soil of the Americas, unaware that ships already are being built that will one day carry its dried leaves across the water, transforming it from local sacred leaf to global commodity, from mediator of spirit to servant of empire. When at last pale sails appear on western horizons, they come like teeth biting into the smooth line where sea meets sky. Wooden caravels creak and list as they push into Caribbean waters, carrying men who smell of tar, sweat, and old hopes. They bring iron and gunpowder, hunger for gold, and a book of prayers written in a tongue the island breezes do not understand. Stepping ashore, these newcomers see plants and animals unknown to their eyes. Among these is tobacco, rising modestly from gardens and forest edges, its leaves heavy with stored sun. The first encounters are cautious, curious, uneasy. Sailors and soldiers watch as islanders and mainland peoples alike roll tobacco leaves into stout bundles, one end lit to a glowing coal. They see smoke drawn deep into chests, held and then released in slow, luxuriant plumes. The gesture is unhurried, dignified, imbued with social and spiritual meaning. Yet the observers do not understand the prayers carried on that breath, the invocations woven into the rising strands. They see only a practice that astonishes and intrigues them. Some try it themselves, coughing at the initial harshness, then feeling a spreading warmth, a lightheadedness that to some feels like joy. Curiosity stirs where perhaps reverence should have stood. Soon dried bundles of tobacco are loaded into the holds of ships, laid alongside sacks of strange beans that will become cacao, and shining nuggets that will be minted into coins, and bright macaw feathers meant for collectors' cabinets. The Atlantic, once a barrier, becomes a slow-moving bridge of salt over which tobacco, among so many other things, will travel. In damp European ports, barrels are opened, and the new leaf is examined, crumbled. It is rolled into crude cigars, packed into pipes made hastily of clay, inhaled by sailors and dock workers, by apothecaries and gentlemen, each drawing their own conclusions from the unfamiliar sensation. Picture the first European lips wrapped around a pipe stem, in a low, smoky tavern, where the walls weep with moisture and the floorboards remember centuries of spilled ale. Outside, fog lies thick over the harbour. Inside, the air begins to braid with another greyness. The smoke of tobacco. It bites, it scratches, it sears the throat, then unfurls as a dizzy bloom behind the eyes, a mild hurricane in the quiet of one's own skull. Some recoil, others lean into the feeling, chasing it, learning how deeply to draw, how long to hold. The learned of the age turn their attention to this novelty. Physicians steeped in humoral theory and the teachings of Galen consider tobacco's heat and dryness, debating whether it might balance melancholic temperaments or purge choleric excess. Some praise it as a panacea, a marvel that might ward off plague, cure headaches, ease digestive ills. Others warn that anything with such strong effects must also bear hidden dangers. Priests, too, are divided. Some see tobacco's use among indigenous peoples as a pagan custom to be suppressed, while others quietly adopt its comforts, their own chambers filling with faint blue haze. In royal courts, the plant becomes a performer. Courtiers practice the art of exhaling in languid spirals, of holding a pipe or cigar with practiced elegance, as though it were an extension of their status, their cultivated nonchalance. The sacred stories that once wrapped tobacco like a cloak are largely left behind, caught in languages not yet translated. In Europe's crowded cities, its smoke is no longer a prayer or a carefully opened doorway to the unseen, but a novelty, a pastime, an exotic habit with just enough danger to be intriguing. Yet beneath each curling ribbon of smoke, indifferent to context, the same molecule does its work silently. Nicotine crosses from leaf to lung to blood to brain, beginning a new acquaintance with nervous systems that human to different diets, different climates, different paces of life. It learns the rhythms of merchants and sailors, of scholars burning midnight candles over texts, of soldiers warming themselves by campfires. Slowly, gently at first, it begins to map cravings into these new populations, to teach them the relief that follows the rising tension of need. Commerce catches the scent of opportunity. The demand for tobacco rises like one of its own smoke columns in still air. Lands across the ocean, recently carved into colonies, foreign powers, are deemed suitable ground for mass cultivation. In the Tidewater regions of Virginia and Maryland, in the rich ochre soils of Caribbean valleys, forests are felled with systematic violence. Old trees, who have watched seasons turn for centuries, crash to the ground under axes wielded by men, following orders signed an ocean away. Stumps are pulled, roots burned, and in their place emerge neat, endless rows of small green plants, tobacco, domesticated and conscripted into the service of markets. The labor that coaxes these plants from earth to harvest is stolen. Enslaved Africans, torn from their own lands and cultures, are forced into this new choreography of sowing, weeding, pruning, and cutting. Dawn finds them in fields still silvered with mist, their bare feet sinking into damp soil. Resin from the leaves clings to their fingers, sticky and bitter, seeping through skin into blood, an unchosen intimacy with nicotine that precedes any conscious act of inhalation. The sun climbs, unrelenting, and the rows stretch on like sentences with no punctuation, no reprieve. In low, dark barns, tobacco hangs in heavy sheaves, leaves turning slowly from supple to brittle, their color deepening to the brown of aged leather, to the dark gloss of polished wood. Fires burn faintly on the earthen floors, their smoke kept gentle and consistent, coaxing out the last of the leaf's moisture, setting its chemistry into the form that will travel well. The air is dense, aromatic, almost edible, bearing notes of spice and something harsher beneath. Here, tobacco becomes commodity, its sacred associations stripped away and rendered into bales stamped with symbols of ownership and origin. Ledgers record weights and prices, not prayers and songs. Ships that once cautiously carried a few bundles now ferry entire holds filled with cured leaf. Tobacco joins sugar and cotton in the grim litany of goods, whose cultivation is inseparable from enslavement, each plant a link in chains that bind continents in a triangle of profit and suffering. In city counting houses, thousands of miles away, merchants run ink-stained fingers down columns of figures, oblivious to the calloused hands that harvested the leaves whose sale enriches them. Tobacco has ceased to be merely a plant. It has become an engine, a green gear in the machinery of empire. Nicotine moves quietly through these new pathways, a ghost in the system. It whispers differently to different ears. To the planter, it promises wealth, a means to rise from obscurity to prominence. To the merchant, it offers steady returns, a commodity whose demand seems insatiable. To the enslaved worker, it is more often a source of fatigue and headache, soaking through skin as they handle the leaves, another weight added to bodies already bowed by labor. Yet beneath these variations, it remains the same restless molecule, indifferent to justice and injustice, flowing wherever the channels of power and habit direct it. As years fold into decades and centuries, the world changes again. The slow rhythms of agricultural life give way, in many places, to the clatter and clangor of machines. Steam hisses from iron lungs, gears mesh and turn, pistons rise and fall like mechanical hearts. Cities swell as people leave fields for factories, trading the wide sky for brick walls and the smell of soil for coal smoke. Time itself seems to quicken, measured now not by the angle of the sun but by clocks mounted high in towers and on factory walls. Tobacco too learns a faster language. Where once it was smoked in pipes that needed cleaning, in cigars that required deliberate production, it now finds a new form, the cigarette. Thin, tightly rolled cylinders of shredded leaf wrapped in paper, each one made to be lit, consumed and discarded in minutes. Early hand-rolling gives way, before long, to machines, ingenious, relentless contraptions that can produce thousands of these paper-wrapped embers in an hour. The Bonsack machine and others like it transform what was once a relatively slow ritual into something that can be repeated almost without thinking, over and over throughout the day. Picture a cavernous factory in the late 19th century, filled with the metallic chatter of such machines. Belts carry endless strips of paper, funnels rain down cut tobacco in precise measured streams, blades snip off finished cigarettes with mechanical precision. Women and men stand at long tables, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of devices that do not time. Dust filled with flecks of leaf hangs in the air, coating lungs without consent. The output is staggering, tidy little tubes of promise, stacked in boxes, wrapped in branding that will soon become familiar in every corner of the civilized world. In the dense quarters of growing cities, in alleys smelling of coal and damp, in the courtyards of textile mills and steelworks, cigarettes find ready hands. Their smallness is their genius. They can be lit and finished in the brief respite between tasks, in the 5 minutes snatched outside a factory door, in the narrow gap between one train and the next. Their smoke mingles with the soot and steam of the industrial age, a private haze within the public miasma. Nicotine, delivered quickly through this more efficient vessel, slips into the blood with speed, reaching the brain in heartbeats. Its effects are brief but pointed, a sharpening of attention, a smoothing of frayed nerves, a sense of tiny sanctuary carved out amid noise and pressure. War amplifies this role, in mud-slick trenches and frost-bitten bivouacs, in barracks that smell of wool and worry. Cigarettes become companions as necessary as ration, bread or cartridges. Soldiers light them with shaking hands as shells thud in the distance, drawing on their embers as if reassurance could be inhaled. Smoke drifts between men as they wait, a fragile, shared veil against mortality. Armies begin issuing tobacco as part of standard provisions, acknowledging, perhaps unconsciously, that this little wrapped leaf has become a kind of portable solace, a means of stitching ragged nerves back together, however temporarily. While the machines clatter and the wars rage, another transformation is underway, quieter, lit not by furnaces but by gas lamps in laboratory. The long lineage of inquiry that began with ancient alchemists, those who gazed into bubbling retorts seeking the essence of matter, has by now evolved into something more systematic, more exacting. Chemistry. In universities and research institutions built upon the wealth of trade and empire, glassware gleams, powders and liquids are labeled and ordered, and invisible forces are coaxed into every more precise expression. Tobacco, whose smoke has now traveled the globe, inevitably draws the attention of these scientists. What is it, exactly, that gives this plant its peculiar hold on the body, its capacity to awaken and to soothe, to charm and to sicken? Early investigators steep leaves in acids and alcohols, evaporate solvents, distill and redistill, smelling and tasting cautiously, watching for reactions. Step by step they separate the plant into fractions, chasing, though they may not yet know it, a single, commanding presence. In the early decades of the 19th century, this pursuit crystallizes. Two German researchers, Wilhelm Heinrich Posselt and Carl Ludwig Riemann, after long hours at the bench, managed to tease from tobacco leaves an oily, colorless substance, neither leaf nor smoke, but something distilled from both. It carries a biting, peppery odor, a sensation on the tongue that warns of strength. Applied in small amounts to the bodies of small animals, it proves swiftly lethal, stopping hearts with ruthless efficiency. Here at last is the plant's ghost brought into a single, graspable form. They name it nicotine, after Nicotiana, the genus of the tobacco plant itself, whose name in turn honors Jean Nicot, the French diplomat, who centuries earlier introduced tobacco to his court as a medicinal curiosity. In this baptism, the molecule that has moved unseen through so many chests and brains is given a proper place in the taxonomy of knowledge. Its structure, still unknown in exact detail at that moment, is nevertheless recognized as bearing nitrogen, one of those elusive, reactive elements that so often lurk within substances of great potency. Experiments reveal nicotine's paradoxical nature. In small doses, it stimulates hearts beat faster, alertness rises, the mind seems to wake to a brighter edge. Yet it also calms, apparently easing anxiety, smoothing mood, as though patting the shoulder of some inner animal. Larger doses, however, prove toxic, even deadly. Doctors and pharmacologists debate its potential as a therapeutic agent, wondering if it might be tamed and harnessed for certain ills, even as they note its dangers. For the first time, humanity can point to a single, named entity, and say, here resides much of the power of tobacco, here lies the hook beneath the flavors and the rituals. But naming is not the same as mastering. If anything, the relationship between humans and nicotine grows more intricate. Industry learns, slowly but surely, how to court and shape this molecule's effects, how to craft tobacco products that deliver it in ways most likely to ensure repeated use. Science has lit a candle within the cavern of craving, illuminating some of its contours, but the light also reveals how deep that cavern goes. The 20th century dawns with its particular brilliance and shadow. Cities blossom with electric lights. Cars begin to swarm like bright beetles along paved roads. Telephones bind voices across distances once measured in days. Against this backdrop of modern marvels, tobacco strides into yet another role, not merely a daily habit, but a symbol. Companies that have grown fat on cigar and cigarette sales now enlist artists, copywriters, and increasingly psychologists to weave narratives around their products. Smoke, once a simple exhalation, becomes an image carefully crafted and sold. Imagine broad city streets lined with posters taller than a man, their colors rich, their surfaces glossy. On them, an athlete, the very picture of health, holds a cigarette with relaxed confidence. A cowboy on an immense plain, sky vaulting endlessly above him, pauses from his solitary labor to light one between his lips. A glamorous woman in a sparkling gown reclines in soft focus, smoke curling from her fingers like a cat's tail. None of them cough, none of them age, none of them die. Instead, the cigarette is their companion in freedom, in sophistication, in a calm beyond ordinary reach. On the radio, warm, reassuring voices speak of certain brands as though they were trusted friends, suggesting that their smoke is smoother, kinder to the throat, even beneficial. In printed advertisements, men in white coats, actors, posed as physicians, are shown tipping open packs and smiling, as if having made the most rational scientific choice. Slogans link cigarettes to relaxation after work, to convivial gatherings, to romance. The act of lighting, inhaling and exhaling, is framed as an emblem of adulthood, of autonomy, of modern composure. In darkened cinemas, light flickers over audiences as they watch heroes and heroines lean in across tables, a thin wisp of smoke between them like a bridge. Detectives pause mid-investigation to take a thoughtful drag, minds apparently sharpened by the act. Rebels defy authority with a cigarette dangling from their lips, the burning tip a tiny red flag of defiance. Young eyes watch, absorb and imitate, their first cigarettes lit less for the chemical effect than for the identity it promises. Behind the scenes of this theater, tobacco companies adjust their products with exacting care. Leaf is blended from different regions to achieve desired aromas and strength. Papers are chosen not only for burn qualities, but for how they whiten ash, making it appear somehow purer. Filters are added, not so much to dramatically reduce harm, but to provide reassurance. Small paper and cellulose talismans, implying protection. Nicotine levels are monitored and tuned to maintain a balance between satisfaction and the urging of another lit match. Consumption curves climb steadily, each new plateau forming the base for a higher ascent. Yet even as the public face of smoking glows with glamour, other minds are quietly troubled. In hospitals and clinics, sharp-eyed physicians begin noticing patterns. More patients with certain kinds of coughing, with persistent chest infections, with unexplained weight loss and bloody sputum, share a common habit. They smoke, often heavily, often since youth. Pathologists, those who learn from the opened bodies of the dead, find lungs marred by black deposits, airways narrowed and stiffened, signs of malignancies spreading like dark stars within delicate tissue. Numbers, at first small, then growing, hint that what feels like comfort may harbor a hidden cost. As the 20th century progresses, research becomes more systematic. Epidemiologists, wielding patient records and statistical methods, map the relationship between smoking and disease. They line up data from cities and villages, from nations with high tobacco use, and those with less, drawing careful, sober lines between exposure and outcome. Graphs emerge whose slopes are alarming, tracing upward arcs of lung cancer, heart disease, emphysema. What was once an intuition hardens into evidence. The smoke that carries nicotine into the body is not merely a delivery system, but itself a source of poison, laden with tar, carbon monoxide and a multitude of chemicals, some naturally occurring, some formed in the fierce heat of combustion. At the same time, behind corporate walls, another set of documents accumulates. Internal memos from tobacco executives and scientists acknowledge, in guarded language, both the addictiveness of nicotine and the mounting evidence of harm. They explore ways to preserve sales, in the face of potential regulation, to deflect public concern, to cast doubt upon clear finding. Nicotine becomes, in these papers, not just the heart of tobacco's appeal, but the keystone of a business model, a force to be maintained at effective levels, even as other aspects of cigarettes are adjusted for appearance. In parallel, tobacco companies refine their understanding of how cigarettes deliver nicotine. In sterile rooms under fluorescent lights, machines built to mimic human smoking habits draw puffs of standardized volume and duration, their mechanical lips clamped around filter tip. Instruments measure the concentration of nicotine and other compounds in the resulting smoke. Variables are tweaked, the tightness of the roll, porosity of the paper, the exact blend of leaves. Additives such as ammonia are introduced to change the chemical state of nicotine, making it more volatile, more readily absorbed through the lungs. Flavors are added that mask harshness, make inhalation easier, smoother, more pleasant for beginners. Picture white-coated researchers leaning over charts, noting how small changes in design lead to different pharmacological profiles. They have become, in essence, engineers of craving, tuning a device that fits in the hand but touches the nervous system with precise insistence. The goal is not an accidental pleasure, but a reliable pattern, a swift spike of satisfaction followed by a sag, prompting the next cigarette, the next purchase, the next breath of dependence. Nicotine, once a wild spirit negotiated with through ritual, has been transformed into a controlled current running through the circuitry of modern commerce. Within the human brain, removed from all of this noise, the molecule's work remains elegantly simple. Inhaled nicotine crosses the membranes of the lungs with ease, slipping into rich streams of oxygenated blood. Carried along arteries, it ascends into the skull, passing through the blood-brain barrier as though it were a guest with a key. There it seeks out its particular partners, nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, proteins embedded in the membranes of neurons that usually respond to the body's own acetylcholine, a messenger involved in attention, muscle movement, and the regulation of arousal. When nicotine binds to these receptors, they open, allowing charged particles to flow across the neuronal membrane. This ionic torrent alters the electrical state of the cell, encouraging it to fire, to pass along its signal to neighbors. In certain circuits, especially those involved in reward, this cascade leads to the release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter often associated with pleasure, motivation, and reinforcement. The smoker may not know the names of any of these chemicals, but they feel their consequences, a small lifting of mood, a brightening of focus, a sense that the world has shifted a fraction of a degree toward bearability. With repetition, the brain adapts. Cells, overwhelmed by persistent stimulation, respond by reducing the number or sensitivity of their nicotinic receptors. The same dose of nicotine now produces a smaller effect. To achieve the previous level of comfort or alertness, more is needed, or more frequent administration. What began as a choice becomes, gradually, a compulsion stitched into the very structure of synapses. And when nicotine is suddenly withheld, those adapted circuits protest. Without the expected chemical tide, they produce sensations of restlessness, irritability, difficulty concentrating, a grayness of mood, a tightening of the chest, not only physical, but emotional. Craving emerges as both a memory of relief and an anticipation of its absence. Imagine, in a modest apartment late at night, a person standing by a small open window. Outside, the city has quieted somewhat, though distant engines and occasional voices still betray its ceaseless activity. Inside, the air is stale, tinged with the ghost of past cigarettes. The person lights one more, despite having promised themselves many times that the last was truly the last. They step toward the window, exhale into the darkness, watching the smoke lose form as it rises. Their mind briefly softens around the edges, thoughts that had been pressing relent. For a few minutes there is peace, but even as it arrives, it contains the seed of its own departure, the knowledge that soon, perhaps in an hour, perhaps upon waking, the same need will call again. This is the circuit of relief and requirement that nicotine draws, an invisible loop coiled within neurons, looping in planes and trains, in offices and on park benches, in quiet rooms where solitary figures negotiate with themselves. By the latter half of the 20th century, the world's understanding of this bargain has deepened. What was once a suspicion is now an accepted truth. Smoking causes disease on a vast scale. Reports issued by public health authorities, painstakingly compiled and soberly worded, lay out the connections between tobacco use and lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and chronic respiratory condition. Photographs of diseased organs, of blackened lungs whose once spongy tissue has turned stiff and grotesque, make the invisible visible. Numbers, millions of lives shortened, billions of hours of health lost. Attempt to measure the immeasurable. In hospitals, scenes unfold that invert the glamorous images of earlier decades. Patients, gaunt and pale, stand just outside revolving doors, clad in thin gowns that flap in cold air. The transparent tubing of oxygen cannulas loops beneath their nostrils, attached to tanks that hiss softly at their side. Despite these apparatuses of life support, they hold cigarettes between their fingers, hands trembling slightly. They inhale, exhale, cough, inhale again. The very substance implicated in their suffering remains, for many, a source of comfort too dear to surrender abruptly. The grip of nicotine, its engraving upon their neural pathways, its pairing with virtually every emotion and habit of their adult lives, holds more strongly than any pamphlet or warning label. Societies respond with a complex mixture of compassion, fear, anger, and control. Laws are enacted restricting advertising, banishing the seductive posters and jingles from public spaces. Graphic warnings, some bearing images of diseased tissue or stark, bold text, are mandated for cigarette packages. Smoking is pushed from offices and airplanes, then from restaurants and bars, then from many public areas altogether. What was once a default aspect of social life becomes, slowly, a contested and then prescribed act, relegated to doorways and side streets, to small designated corners of concrete, where a few figures huddle in rain or heat, sharing lighters and silence. Courtrooms become theaters for another kind of reckoning. Internal documents from tobacco companies once guarded are brought into the open, their careful phrasing examined under legal and public scrutiny. Testimony is given about decisions made, about what was known and when, about strategies for sowing doubt and resisting regulation. Settlements are reached, funds earmarked for healthcare and education. Yet for those whose lives have already been shaped and shortened by decades of nicotine's presence, these measures arrive late. The ink dries on agreements while elsewhere, someone coughs into a handkerchief and sees the first trace of red. In response to the recognition of harm, new approaches arise. Pharmaceutical companies develop products designed to help people sever, or at least loosen, the bonds of dependence. Nicotine patches deliver the molecule through the skin in slow, steady streams, akin to feeding a river with a very gradual melt of snow rather than a sudden storm. Gums and lozenges release it in the mouth, where it crosses into the bloodstream more gently than through the explosive rush of inhaled smoke. The goal is not to sustain the habit, but to soften the withdrawal, to give the brain time to readjust its expectations and its biology. At the same time, engineers inspired by both harm reduction and profit propose a more radical shift. If it is the smoke, with its tar and its many combustion products, that inflicts much of the damage, could nicotine be delivered without burning plant matter at all? Thus emerge vapes and e-cigarettes, devices that heat a liquid, usually containing nicotine, flavorings, and a base such as propylene glycol or glycerin into an aerosol for inhalation. These devices are sleek, technological, bearing little resemblance to a twisted leaf. They glow with small lights, emit clouds that smell not of char and ash, but of fruits, candies, menthol, or unplaceable sweetness. Picture a group of young people in a twilight park, their conversations interspersed not with the flare of matches, but with the soft click of buttons. They raise small metallic or plastic rods to their lips, inhale, and produce exhalations so dense they momentarily obscure their faces. The vapor billows, then vanishes quickly, leaving little trace. For some in the group, these devices are a step away from cigarettes, a negotiated truce with their own lungs and futures. For others, they are a first touch point, an introduction to nicotine, unburdened by the stigma of smoke, presented instead as a modern accessory, a customizable indulgence. Public health finds itself navigating a new maze. On one wall is the potential for these non-combustible forms to pull long-term smokers away from the deadliest delivery system, reducing, if not eliminating, the harm from their continued need. On another is the risk that attractive flavors, slick marketing, and the very novelty of the devices might draw in those who otherwise might never have encountered nicotine at all, particularly the young, whose brains are still knitting themselves into adult forms and are thus particularly sensitive to patterns of reinforcement. Once again, nicotine flows into the spaces carved by desire and anxiety, by social signaling and subtle rebellion, by the eternal human search for something that smooths the rough edges of consciousness. And so, under the turning sky of the current age, nicotine persists as a small, potent knot of possibility, winding through human history. From the sacred fires of pre-colonial forests, to the glowing tips of factory-made cigarettes, from the measured drops in laboratory vials, to the invisible streams in patches and mists, it has been both medicine and poison, ally and adversary, salvation and slow undoing. The molecule itself has not changed. Its atoms hold together in the same arrangement they always have, obeying the silent laws of chemistry, indifferent to our narratives. Around it, however, the stories have multiplied, branched, and curled back upon themselves like smoke in a still room. If one could unroll time like a scroll and inscribe upon it every moment in which nicotine touched a human life, the record would stretch beyond the horizon. There would be scenes of healing rituals in lamplit caves, each exhale a plea to unseen forces for the life of a child or the success of a hunt. There would be farmers, enslaved and free, bent over fields in morning mist, their fingers stained by resin, their backs aching. There would be soldiers on foreign soil, hands cupping a cigarette against wind as they listen for distant artillery. There would be lovers, sharing a lighter outside a dance hall, conspiratorial smiles passing between them along with the flame. There would be solitary figures at kitchen tables, tapping ash into chipped saucers as they stare at nothing in particular, thinking of everything at once. Amid all of these, some lives might be lengthened or made more bearable by the brief comforts nicotine offers, a respite from intolerable stress, a sharpened focus that enables work that otherwise might not have been completed. Many more, however, are shortened, diminished, constrained by illness that creeps in quietly, taking root long before symptoms announce its presence. As societies grapple with this duality, laws are written and revised, debates rage, and research continue. Compassion is called for, not only for those who suffer at the tobacco-related end of their lives, but also for those still entwined with the molecule's daily demands, their choices shaped by forces that began long before they were born. Somewhere tonight, in a small room lit by a single lamp, a person stares at a half-empty pack of cigarettes. They feel the familiar tug in their chest, not quite pain, not quite longing, but something in between. They think of their children, their parents, their own bodies' quiet labor on their behalf. With hands that tremble slightly, they crush the pack and throw it in the bin, then retrieve it, smooth it out, then throw it away again. Later, perhaps, they will place a small, square patch upon their skin, trusting that its slow seep of nicotine will hold them through the first, jagged days of absence. Elsewhere in another city, a teenager unscrews a small bottle of flavored liquid, refills a device, and takes a tentative puff, entering without knowing it into a story whose roots reach back to shamans and sailors, planters and chemists. In the vast collective inhalation and exhalation of the planet, breath drawn through billions of throats each moment, nicotine is but one current among many. Yet its path tells us much about ourselves. It is a mirror held up to human ingenuity and vulnerability, to our capacity to turn a wild, potent leaf into prayer, currency, comfort and catastrophe. It shows how we seek over and over substances and practices that promise to steady the flicker of our inner flame, to give us a sense of control over the tides of mood and fate, even at great cost. As another night deep and stars once again arrange themselves above cities and forests alike, some will fall asleep with the faint smell of stale smoke in their rooms, others with the faint sting of a patch under their shirt, others with none of these, but with other habits and hungers, curling quietly within. The restless leaf that once grew wild on riverbanks, its broad green hands lifted to the sun, continues its journey beneath names and forms. Within blood and story, its ghost molecule nicotine waits always for context, for the intention of the hands that hold it, for the spirit in which its breath is taken. In that waiting lies a question directed not to the plant, nor to chemistry, but to us. How shall we carry our desires, our fears, our need for solace, without surrendering the very breath that bears them? The answer, like smoke, rises, twists and begins to thin, even as someone somewhere draws another slow inhalation and watches it climb toward the dark, patient sky.